My name's Alison Assiter, and I'm in the philosophy department at UWE. And this event is in two different kind of series. One is the Social Science in the City, which is a series of talks that take place in the city involving different people from University of the West of England. But the other is that we're doing a kind of Bristol launch of a relatively new journal. And we're all three of us are on the editorial board of this journal, which is called Feminist Dissent. And on your chairs, you'll see some flyers about the journal. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the journal, and then I'm going to introduce our two speakers tonight. So the journal is, the title is important. The focus for the journal is partly that we're seeing across the world at the moment a rise in fundamentalist forms of thinking, fundamentalist forms of religion. And I'm not going to attempt a definition of fundamentalism because at least one of you, I'm sure, will contradict what I say. But broadly, what we mean by fundamentalist forms of religion is those forms of religion that look to give a very strict and sometimes literal interpretation of texts and don't welcome dissenting views. And that's part of the reason for our name, Dissent. They also frequently want to impose their views by violence, different forms of violence. And there are, of course, fundamentalist forms of Hinduism, Christianity, and at least Islam. There are others, but those are probably the three biggest forms. And we also think in the journal, one of the things we want to investigate is the links between forms of fundamentalism and gender. And if you look across the world, there have been many attacks, particularly on women, on reproductive rights, on girls. They're not exclusively, of course, the attacks that we can think of. They're not exclusively directed towards women, but many of them are. And so we want to explore in the journal the links between gender and forms and fundamentalism. But we also, and this is the final thing I'm going to say, and it links with our talk tonight, we also want to pose the question, is there a connection between the rise in forms of fundamentalism, and I should say that these go alongside racist attacks from groups that are not associated with, not necessarily, and usually not associated with religious fundamentalism, but the two things are really seem to be going alongside one another. But the final thing is that we want to look at the question whether or not forms of fundamentalism are correlated with critiques of and attacks on the notion of a universal human right. And I think that links with the topic of tonight's talk. And I'd like to introduce our two speakers tonight. Who's going to speak first? She's putting up her hand to me. That's nice. So the two speakers are Pragna Patel, who's on my right here, on your left of me. And she is the chair and the founding member of Southall Black Sisters, and some of you, I'm sure, will know of the wonderful work that Southall Black Sisters do, not only in Southall, but in other areas as well. And on my left, and she's going to speak first, on my left is Gita Sahgal, who is, she was the Secularist of the Year last year. Were you not? I thought you were. Oh, there you go. She wasn't. But anyway, she should have been. She should have been. She would have been if we had any say in the matter, but we didn't. She chairs the Centre for Secular Space, and she's a journalist and filmmaker, and she also used to be the head of gender at Amnesty International. So the two of them are going to talk on dissent and Sharia law in the context of austerity. So Pragna, first to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Alison. It's lovely to be here on a lovely sunny evening in Bristol. What I decided to do today in relation to this area is actually to look back at some of the struggles that we at Southall Black Sisters have waged, to see the kind of trajectory and the kind of where we are now in terms of those struggles, and the journey that we have taken in relation to fighting religious fundamentalisms. Southall Black Sisters is an advocacy and campaigning organisation for black and minority women. We're based in West London. But throughout our 37 years or so of existence, we've gained important insights into the lives of black and minority women in particular, lives that encapsulate the many dilemmas and contradictions that they face in their daily struggle for survival and for freedom in the face of racism, poverty, patriarchal control, and increasingly religious fundamentalism. So over the years, women who walk through our doors have demanded support and assistance in the face of domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, and also in the face of cultural and religious restrictions on their personal freedoms, exacerbated by poverty, by racism, and increasingly draconian and inhumane immigration controls. Our work, by its very nature, involves applying an intersectional gaze to these issues, and particularly to questions of race, gender, class, sexuality, and power. In other words, to analyze the interrelatedness of the various forms of discrimination that heighten injustice and inequality faced by black and minority women. This analysis, this intersectional analysis, then demands of us a commitment to challenge all forms of oppression simultaneously. And the reason we do that is we want to avoid creating a hierarchy of victimhood and a hierarchy of struggles. One of the reasons for that is because those of us who locate ourselves in anti-racist struggles often had to resist from within the idea that this anti-racist struggle took priority over other struggles, including gender, for gender equality and equalities of other kinds. In the UK, in the 80s, there's following some really serious resistance against racial violence and institutional racism, the state's approach to minorities and race relations saw a move away from earlier politics of assimilation and intolerance towards minorities to some of the most progressive multicultural policies in Europe, by which I mean multiculturalism. It became a really useful tool in developing wider progressive anti-racist strategies, which involved recognizing the idea and accepting the idea of difference. So multiculturalism was probably at its height in the 90s. But by the early 90s, it had also become problematic for us as black feminists because the way it was officially implemented. Multicultural policies gave way to a form of regressive anti-racism that only concerned itself with the preservation and ossification of minority identities and cultural values, and rather than looking at culture and religion and minority communities in a kind of more dynamic way. And it was at that moment, I would say from the mid-80s, late 80s, definitely 90s onwards, that I would pinpoint the moment when the struggle against the politics of multiculturalism and black feminism became inextricably linked, because we were forced to challenge the politics of multiculturalism. It rested on the concept or on the assumption that minority communities are united, homogeneous, with fixed and clearly defined boundaries, with no internal divisions of power, and that self-appointed community leaders, usually from religious but also business classes, had the right to speak on behalf of minority communities that they claimed to represent. And in effect, what they did, and these were all male, usually male leaders, conservative, was that they shored up their own class, caste, and patriarchal power and privilege in minority communities. So our challenge to multiculturalism was not so much about negating it, because it was progressive as a concept, but to redefine it, This meant, first and foremost, avoiding making our own cultures and religions immune from criticism. We've always stated that our identities are fluid, dynamic, syncretic, as opposed to being static and singular, and that community leaders are not the gatekeepers of cultural and religious identities and traditions. But ours were not the voices that were heard. Nevertheless, our struggles and contestations led to some seminal moments in the history of multicultural Britain. We saw the Stephen Lawrence case, for example, which led to the official recognition of institutional racism. And by the late 90s, minority women's struggles led to the recognition of violence against minority women, including issues like forced marriage, honor-based violence, as an abuse of women's human rights. Sadly, however, my view is that we were denied the chance to develop mature multiculturalism, or critical multiculturalism, as we saw it, because it was almost immediately, those historical moments were overshadowed by the Patel report in the aftermath of the 2001 race riots in the northern cities of England, and of course by the war on terror following the London bombings in 2005. Suddenly, the national discourse changed to arguments about how minorities, immigrants, refugees are suited or unsuited to the cultural values of the host society. The state has retreated from multiculturalism, a move that is more or less closely also tied to the lurch to the political right throughout Europe. And that includes the enactment of profoundly draconian and inhumane anti-immigration policies. That's part of the lurch to the political right. So everywhere, we're now seeing multiculturalism replaced by models of cohesion and integration. In fact, that's the discourse that's used. But these are also politically loaded, since they're underpinned by highly regressive assimilationist, racist, and nationalist tendencies. They effectively focus on blaming minorities for fracturing and destabilizing society. The so-called backward traditions of minority groups are seen to create conflict with the so-called normal and Western cultures and values. So minority communities are actually blamed for their own marginality, for leading parallel lives, and for causing segregation. And the immense social deprivation that minorities face, or large sections of minorities face around the country, is understood in simplistic culture terms, rather than years of structural racism and disparities, cronyism, and democratic deficits in the local governance, or the phenomenon of white flight from areas populated by minorities. So whether intended or not, the discourse around community cohesion and integration is used by both the media and politicians to reduce the whole thing to a matter of relations between the races, rather than to structural inequality and racism that is located in economic, political, and ideological relations. So issues brought to the fore by black feminists, such as forced marriage, are explicitly used to justify ever restrictive immigration controls and to create a moral panic about minorities. So we are in a moment, I think, where the task in front of us is to resist both old and new forms of racism. But this is made all the more difficult by the fact that we're now operating in an economic and political climate that has now embraced the idea of multifaithism, which has replaced multiculturalism. And this, I think, poses an even greater challenge to those of us who insist on challenging racism whilst also continuing to fight for women's rights. What we're seeing is a slide from multiculturalism to multifaithism. And it's a process that started in the aftermath of the Rushdie affair in 1989. And since then, we've seen a series of moves that contradict the cohesion and integration model that successive governments have tried to foster. The British state has both embraced religious identity and, through that, religious fundamentalism, through what can be termed soft, faith-based social policy measures, whilst at the same time it's enacting draconian anti-civil rights measures that underpin the so-called war on terror in order to deal with religious extremism. A new social contract has emerged post 9/11, post the London bombings, between religious minorities, leaderships, and the British state, in which a degree of religious and communal autonomy is granted in respect of private family matters in return for preserving the status quo in relation to public matters, particularly public order. The new multi-faith network has in effect reduced a complex web of social, political, and cultural processes into purely abstract and authentic religious values within minority communities that are largely determined by regressive religious forces, often masquerading as moderates. The reality is many of these religious forces portray themselves as moderates on British soil, but foment violence and fundamentalism abroad. And what we're seeing as a result of that fostering of that relationship is a defeat of the equality paradigm and the rapid desecularization of democratic, parliamentary, civic, and cultural spaces. Ironically, it's precisely these secular spaces, not faith-based leaderships or faith-based groups within minority communities, that gave rise to the emergence of campaigns and organizations that created normative shifts on gender-based violence and social justice. Yet these are the very spaces that are now supplanted by state-backed fundamentalist and authoritarian religious bodies, whose key goal is to subvert human rights values to maintain power and hegemony over minority communities. This has in turn strengthened religious identity politics and actually prevented a culture of citizenship and human rights from taking root in minority communities. The slide from multiculturalism to multifaithism is perhaps nowhere better encapsulated than in the growing alignment that we're witnessing in this country of religion and the law. It is a phenomenon that is, of course, happening globally, but it is also happening locally in the domestic sphere. And those who are addressing it are human rights defenders, particularly women's rights campaigners. In his now famous lecture on the rule of law in 2006, Lord Bingham, who has since died, but at the time was one of the UK's most prominent judges, he said this. He said, in a world divided by differences of nationality, race, colour, religion, and wealth, the rule of law is one of the greatest unifying factors, perhaps the greatest. It remains an ideal, but an ideal worth striving for, in the interest of good government and peace at home and in the world at large. He went on to outline the core tenets of the rule of law, which he argued were necessary for the proper functioning of a democracy. He said that this included the need for accessibility and certainty in law, the absence of arbitrary decision-making, equal application of the law, procedural fairness, and compliance with international, legal, and human rights obligations. So the principle of the rule of law in our work at Southall Black Sisters begs the question, how do you safeguard access to justice for the most vulnerable amongst us? It is a key question that's preoccupied us, but particularly in the last 5 years. Of course, access to justice has always been a central concern of ours, and we've long recognized that the law is an important site of contestation for feminists. And we've used the law in a variety of ways to ensure that the most marginalized and vulnerable can access their right to equality, justice, and fairness in civil and criminal proceedings. This has involved laying bare in the law, as it operates, class, race, and gender norms that reproduce inequality and legitimate exclusionary and discriminatory outcomes for various groups, including black women. But the struggle to access justice has now reached a crisis point for us. The ever-widening shadow of neoliberalism and the rise and dominance of fundamentalist religious identity politics has left us struggling on two interlinked fronts. First, we have to challenge the state for removing legal aid and services from, which in fact is a central pillar of the welfare state. Yeah? And that legal aid is removed from a huge range of civil and criminal matters. And specialist services are being decimated. They impact not only on individual rights, but also on our demands for institutional accountability in the face of abuses of power that are growing and not diminishing. And we're also facing another interlinked challenge, which is the increasing privatization of justice and the state adoption of a faith-based approach to the law itself, the multi-faith approach to the law. This has meant, amongst other things, challenging religious fundamentalists who use the moral and democratic vacuum left by the shrinking welfare state to influence and shape law and social policy. They are influencing with reference to a narrow, illiberal religious identity that they've come to define. And the growing emphasis placed on religious identity has in turn led to demands for the recognition of legal pluralism based on minority religious codes, especially Sharia laws. But demands for the recognition of minority codes within public institutions cannot be understood unless we locate them in the wider contemporary political and social processes that seek to ultimately to shore up elitist religious and patriarchal power. And that power is even less amenable to challenge and to accountability than the formal legal system. It's no accident that efforts to build parallel legal systems in the West, in the UK and elsewhere, coincides neatly with the rise of religious fundamentalists and political Salafi Wahhabi Islam in particular. There has been a concerted effort by religious fundamentalists to compel the UK and other European governments into synchronizing secular so-called Western laws with Muslim religious beliefs that are deemed to be absolute and superior to the law of the land. And for me, faced with all of this, how to understand, well, a critical starting point in any discussion of the legitimacy of what are in effect parallel legal systems of governance is the question of what equality and human rights impact they have on the most marginalized in our communities, such as women and children, sexual minorities, and other religious minorities. Can these so-called minority legal orders afford protection and dispense justice in compliance with the rule of law, or are they a more structured means by which the dynamics of power are hidden and social criticism suppressed? In the UK, Muslim fundamentalists have mounted what can be described as a two-pronged pincer-like maneuver, based ostensibly on the demand for religious tolerance and the right to religion. But in reality, if you look closely at what that agenda is about, it's a bid for religious privilege and power, in which the control of female sexuality is central. Indeed, the demand for the right to manifest religion has largely focused on the female body, ranging from the imposition of dress codes to demands for gender segregation in public spaces and religious governance in family matters. These are the key fundamentalist demands that we are being met with if we're looking at the issue of the law and religion. I call this process Shariafication by stealth of the legal apparatus. It involves making state law and policy Sharia compliant And if successful, we have no doubt that it will lead other minority religions to demand the same level of accommodation. But actually, if you look closely, it's no accident that the family is the key site for fundamentalists, because it's the site most closely governed by religious codes because of the centrality given to women's roles in reproduction and socialization and in the preservation of collective identity. Religious power as a separate source of non-state power regulates women and shapes their rights, privileges, and responsibilities in the family. And these lead to significant unequal outcomes and human rights consequences. So I'm going to give you some examples of how this Shariafication by stealth has occurred. Towards the end of 2012, we saw, against the growing practice of gender segregation at public events in universities, we've seen a rise of these gender segregated events. Against that practice, Universities UK, which is the governing body of British universities, issued guidance which permitted gender segregation of women in university spaces. And they said this to accommodate the religious beliefs of external speakers, religious speakers who demanded gender segregation. The governing body, far from addressing the question of sex discrimination, issued guidance that merely legitimized gender apartheid. It took a campaign and threats of legal action by Southall Black Sisters, One Law for All, and others before the governing body agreed to withdraw the guidance. We challenged the university guidance on the grounds that it violated the equality and non-discrimination principles enshrined in the equality and human rights legislation of this country. And those legislations are themselves the product of long and hard campaigning by feminists, racial minorities, and other marginalized groups. This incident in 2012 was followed by another, in which the UK Law Society this time, a body representing the interests of the legal profession, issued guidance to lawyers on how to prepare Sharia-compliant wills. And the guidance reminded solicitors of what the Law Society deemed to be core principles of Sharia, which were in effect inherently discriminatory against women, adopted children, children born outside marriage, and non-Muslims. What purported to be Sharia laws was in essence fundamentalist and regressive interpretations of Sharia. Interpretations that are actually vigorously contested by women throughout the world. And instead of promoting a rights-based culture, the Law Society was actually wading into doctrinal territory by promoting a Sharia-compliant legal culture. Disturbingly, the guidance was part of a wider program of training courses for solicitors developed by the Law Society to encourage Sharia compliance in respect of family matters, children, property, financial settlements in minority communities. If you also look at the close examination of the workings of Sharia councils and Muslim arbitrations that sit outside the formal legal system, and which are in themselves two of the most visible forms of religious dispute resolution systems in minority communities, we will see serious failings that flout the principles of the rule of law and undermine the rights of women and other minorities in fundamental ways. These forums, the councils and the tribunals, use Sharia laws in highly selective ways. They're not seeking to impose strict criminal codes that would entail cruel or inhuman and degrading punishment, like stoning, because they know that the public has no appetite for those things, but they are seeking to impose codes in relation to family matters. And they want the state to sanction their own religious codes that accord women lesser social status, legal status than men. And there is growing evidence to show from our own experience of frontline casework and from those of other women's organizations that women who use these forums are met with obstacles, discrimination, and hostility when they try to seek divorce or obtain a resolution to their family problems in these forums. There's no question that the forums are primarily concerned with reconciliation, and they reconcile women back into abusive families, even where there is evidence of abuse and violence. In fact, reconciliation is regarded as a moral duty and a religious obligation. But evidence shows that such an approach flies in the face of established feminist good practice in relation to addressing gender-based violence. And it leads to profoundly unequal outcomes and violations of human rights in which the state, by its acquiescence, is complicit. Far from exercising choice or autonomy, the vast majority of BME women, black and minority women, are compelled to use religious arbitration forums out of immense social pressure, lack of knowledge of their legal rights, lack of alternative support systems. Our experience tells us that women who use these forums are actually exercising highly constrained forms of agency and choice in contexts where religion has left them very little room to maneuver. And if there is one theme that runs through the stories of the women who are interviewed by us, who engage with religious codes and forms of arbitration, it is that there is an assault that is taking place on a daily basis on their rights and their dignity. But actually, these women are really alert to the wider dangers of not keeping religion and the law separate. Here are some examples of what women have said to us. One woman said, "There is no need for religious laws, because if you look at the Hindu religion, we had things like sati, that's the immolation of widows. Everyone has the right to live. Hindu religion will never treat women equally. Hinduism says that a husband is like a god and not to answer back. Not right. Everyone should be treated equally in law." Here's another woman. "I'll be honest with you, as a Muslim, someone who believes in the purity of this faith, I don't like Sharia councils. I don't think they should exist. They are for men. That's it. It's predominantly men on those councils. So 4 or 5 men are going to sit around a table and decide whether I can file for this or not, when God has already given me permission to do it." And the third quote, "To be honest with you, the experience I've had with these Molanas and masjids telling me to be patient with abuse and violence, and I was saying, these Sharia councils are set up by men for men. That's how I see it. And as for mediation, I said it's past mediation. I don't want mediation or anything to do with him or his family, and he has no right to his children. The courts have already decided that he has no access to the children, and my daughter's turned 18, and she took out an injunction against him, and my other children can, when they are 18 as adults, they'll do it to protect themselves, because they've seen what kind of a monster we've lived with, and they were on the receiving end of it." So for many women, it is not religious authority, but the formal legal system, no matter how imperfect it is, that represents their best hope of obtaining justice. It is the final safety net, and it acts as a crucial buffer zone between them and patriarchal violence and abuse of power that they experience in the family, community, and in religious institutions. So their experiences show that the space to manifest religion has grown, but the secular space that women and sexual and religious minorities, amongst others, need to be free from oppressive religious imposition and constraints is shrinking daily. They are witness to the impact of religious fundamentalism on their right to life, the right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment, the right to choice in marriage, the right to private life, the right to freedom of expression, the right to an education, and the right to a fair trial. And it's really ironic that elsewhere around the world, women are demanding the separation of religion and the law. And yet many, including women's organisations in minority communities in the UK, are supporting the merger of the two in the name of religious freedom, which actually, if it succeeds, will only reinvigorate patriarchy. The bottom line is that all forms of religious authority and arbitration seek to remove women from the protection of the rule of law. And what worries me just as much is that many legal academics in Britain and feminist academics also promote legal pluralism, which they see as authentic community-based law. But what they are endorsing is an anthropological and theological approach to the law, which tends to ignore statutory law and evolving case law, even in countries that have Muslim personal laws. So as feminists, we have to ask ourselves some pretty hard questions. To what extent can we call the exercise of self-subordination to highly patriarchal practices a feminist choice? Can we afford to ditch our struggles over the years to ensure that the state adopts a rights-based approach to issues like violence against women? And thirdly, do we give up our feminist vision of transformation and equality by aligning ourselves to religious fundamentalists and multi-faith imperatives that ultimately close down crucial secular spaces of resistance and dissent? And I can't resist by ending with a quote from Rushdie, which began this whole process. I think it was his experiences around the publication of the Satanic Verses that foretold the enormity of the struggles that we now face. Rushdie gave a brilliant response to the late black British MP Bernie Grant, who on the anniversary of the burning of the Satanic Verses by fundamentalists said in Parliament, so this is Bernie Grant saying in Parliament, "Burning books is not a big issue for blacks." Rushdie responded by penning an open letter in which he said, You represent, sir, the unacceptable face of multiculturalism, its deformation into an ideology of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the death of ethical thought, supporting the right of tyrannical priests to tyrannize, of despotic parents to mutilate their daughters, of bigoted individuals to hate homosexuals and Jews because it is part of their culture to do so. Bigotry, prejudice, and violence, or the threat of violence, are not human values. They are the proof of the absence of such values. They are not the manifestations of a person's culture. They are indications of a person's lack of culture. In such crucial matters, sir, to quote the great monochrome philosopher Michael Jackson, it don't matter if you're black or white. In my view, any deviation from human values and human rights that people around the world have struggled for, that are universal because they have been struggled for by people around the world, any deviation from those values in the name of anti-racism or anti-Islamophobia amounts to an infantilization of our struggles as black women and represents the death of ethical judgment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
We're just going to take one or two questions to Pragna. Gita will also talk for approximately half an hour. So we will have, at the end, we'll have at least 3/4 of an hour for questions. But if we just take a couple so that you have a chance to say something now to Pragna, and then we'll listen to Gita and have more questions at the end. If there are a couple of questions to Pragna.
I haven't really formulated it properly. But my understanding of Islam is fundamentally about family. It's about the role of women.
Could you hold it so that people can hear you at the back?
Sorry, can you?
Can you hear? No. Yeah, they're saying yes. Okay.
Okay. What I was saying is that Islam is fundamentally about family, the role of women, inheritance, marriage rules and regulations. So how can somebody or a woman who is of the Islamic faith, how can she uphold any of the faith if you remove all of the, not legal, because it isn't legal, it's paralegal, but if you take away these values, how can she defend her faith in that light?
So did everyone hear the question? Yeah? Okay, good. Good.
Oh, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, we just have a couple, yeah.
Well, the first thing I want to say is all religions have codes, in terms of regulating life, particularly private life. So it's not just Islam, but Christianity, Catholicism, Hinduism have codes around family, rules about women's roles and so on. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that the way that you have talked about Islam is that you're presenting it as if it's one static way of being Muslim. And that is not true. Around the world, the first thing I would say is that interpretations of religion have always had to be contextualized within the kind of political, cultural, locations in which they're found. And one person's interpretation is not another person's interpretation. Yeah. And there's always been that fluidity, the ability to absorb from different cultures and ideas and even different religions. And that's certainly true, say, in the Indian subcontinent. And women have always contested interpretations that have been passed down usually through patriarchal structures. So the idea that if you take away these values, there is nothing to defend is a very fallacious premise, because actually there have been progressive, there have been even feminist, there have been more liberal interpretations by women and by many others around the world. And certainly in the context of my work in Southall, with the women that I meet, including women from Muslim backgrounds, if you hear what the women said in those quotes that I gave, what you see are women saying, we are of the faith, but this is not the faith that we recognize. And our interpretation has just as much legitimacy and authenticity, if you want to use that phrase, as anyone else who dictates from a pulpit what that interpretation should be. And actually, our research shows that a lot of the women want to invest their religion with very human rights principles. That the bottom line is their need for compassion, understanding, humanity, and equality. So the idea that the contestations of women is about taking away the faith is not accurate. Actually, they're redefining it to fit and to reflect their own social realities.
Okay, thanks. We'll take one more question and then we'll listen to Gita's presentation, and then there'll be plenty of time for more questions. If there is one more, yeah.
Yeah, as an American who, in principle, and actually in large part, the U.S. is founded on the principle of a separation of church and religion, and it's this historic heritage. That's an odd way of putting it. Anyway, the heritage of the intertwining of religion and the state in the UK it's unseparatable. It's absolutely and totally intertwined, those religious values from they're absolutely intertwined. So I guess, my question is this part of a historic trajectory that goes back to whenever, and that as long as there is not a separation of church and state, how this conundrum, can it ever be solved?
I think that is an important question, because in Feminist Dissent and when I wear my other hat, when I was part of a group called Women Against Fundamentalism, that was one of the first things that we were demanding, separation of the state and the church. Because in the UK, unlike the US, there's never been that separation. So you're absolutely right, the church is in the state is in the church. And until we get that separation, how do you deal with the conundrum when minorities want the same kind of privilege for religion as Christianity has been, as the Church of England has been afforded? I have to say that that's a very difficult struggle, and it is one that's become even more difficult because of the whole trajectory now towards multifaithism, more religion in the state, because it's a way of dealing with the neoliberal crisis, the austerity measures and so on. It helps for the state to encourage religion to take over the role of the state in relation to delivery of services and welfare and so on. So that it is more difficult. But, you know, we have to also remember that the struggles for the separation of religion and the church have taken place, and it wasn't that long ago, and we were reminded, Gita and I, when we were travelling to Bristol today, of how blasphemy laws have been abolished. You know, that was about privileging Christianity in law, but through struggle we did achieve that separation. It's more difficult now with more and more promotion of faith-based schools, faith-based services, faith-based laws, which is what I've described. That is a difficult task. But just because it's inextricably linked, I don't think it's inevitable. And I think that the more we see the contradictions emerge, we will see resistance too against that.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Pragna. We're going to move now to Gita's talk. I think at least, Pragna, you've persuaded the seagulls, but they've stopped chattering now. So Gita, we'll now listen to Gita's talk for approximately half an hour, and then there'll be more time for questions.
Those are really useful questions, actually, because I think they are precisely the things that are in people's minds, the separation of church and state, and then also the issue of whether religions generally, and particularly often Islam is named as a religion that's inherently a certain way. And I think that the reason we established Feminist Dissent was to challenge, one, to argue for precisely these kinds of separations, but not only formal constitutional separations, which are immensely important, but also in social space. I was a founder of a group called the Center for Secular Space, and Alison and Pragna have been involved with helping me think about it and working on issues around it. And my colleague, a co-founder, Yasmin Rehman, was Secularist of the Year only about a couple of weeks ago, the prize handed out by the National Secular Society, and she is a secular Muslim, and that is not an oxymoron. And as a secular Muslim and a feminist, she describes herself as a feminist who's not an Islamic feminist, because her feminism is not tempered by her religion. Her religion is her belief, but her feminism in relation to her work about the liberation of women, the emancipation of women, changing public policy on, she's a coordinator of a coalition on violence against women and girls in her day job, and so on, her feminism is not tempered by the particular beliefs, religious beliefs she holds. It's not restricted in any way by those beliefs. So she remains a believer and she remains a feminist, and she manages the two of them. It's not that it doesn't sometimes cause her difficulties, but it's not impossible. And it's something that I think we have to remember. We have to go back to the founding of modern human rights at the UN, at the founding of the United Nations post-war. The founding of the United Nations is often seen as the victorious powers, the allies in the war who got together to form the Security Council and to found the United Nations in the context of trying to have a system of world governance that would avoid war, never again. And of course, there was a democratic administration. There was Roosevelt, one of the, really great leaders of not just of the United States, but of the world at that time. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a feminist, who were very instrumental in bringing about a cooperative order and founding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that story, told as one of largely the Western powers, but also including the Soviet Union, getting together to found this UN, leaves out a very important story about anti-colonial resistance, about small states, whether they were from Latin America, which had become independent across the 19th and early 20th century, and the very newly decolonized states of India and Pakistan, when the British Empire started decolonizing, who were also at the table, and who were at the table, in fact, before the UN was, at the establishment of the United Nations itself. My grandmother was an Indian nationalist who'd spent time in jail, and she was sent by Gandhi to do battle for the cause of India's freedom, and with the backing of the Roosevelt administration, where at that time, it's hard to remember now, but Americans were anti-imperialists, and opposed many things about the British Empire. And so that sense that states got together in order to to make the Universal Declaration was very much something that was seen by peoples all over the world, colonized peoples who were seen as subject peoples, as their way of claiming a universal citizenship, a right to citizenship, which they didn't yet actually have. And Black Americans who didn't have full citizenship in their own country of birth saw a body above the nation as a way of doing that. And there were alliances formed between political parties and movements, the African National Congress, the ANC, the Congress Party in India, and many other parties, with Pan-African movements and with the ACLU and Black American movements for the universal, to found the United Nations with specific language on the right to self-determination, the right of people who were subjects, because Churchill certainly did not want the subject nations to claim citizenship. His freedom was never the freedom of the British Empire. It was the freedom only of the island of the British Isles. So there was a contest about empire and the ending of empire within the founding of the United Nations, and women were absolutely central to that debate. Not only Eleanor Roosevelt, who's very well known, but a number of Indian feminists who came to the table, and one of them, Hansa Mehta, who was a feminist and a nationalist activist, said that if you don't say men and women are equal in dignity and rights at the beginning, the men will think that it is only about men. Because Eleanor Roosevelt said, the term men and mankind includes women. And she said, no, it doesn't for many of the men at the table. You have to make the women explicit. And Begum Ikramullah, who was a Pakistani feminist representing the Pakistani government and the Muslim League, was also at the table and challenged the Saudis on issues of forced marriage and choice in marriage. They didn't have the term forced marriage at that time, but the issue of choice in marriage is there right at the beginning of the Universal Declaration. And believe me, it wasn't put there because Western feminists or Western women thought it should be there, because it wasn't something that they necessarily would have thought about very profoundly. It was there because a number of people, including across the race divide, because interracial marriages were not permitted at that time in America and many parts of America, the US, as well as in many other countries in the world. So it crossed the racial divide, and it also crossed, it was also about choice in marriage, for people who came from systems where they didn't have such choice. So for us, the issue of religion of itself is not a barrier to the idea of human rights. But it's not that all religions are patriarchal. All religions have to be challenged within a space that is broadly a secular space, because you cannot challenge their power unless you can think of something like the Universal Declaration, like the fact that people, as human beings, gather together in order to frame the values by which they want to live. And it is certainly possible, and was possible, in the late 40s after the Second World War ended, for human beings from across the continents and across the races to gather together in that space in order to decide that they would live by values which they called universal. Now, these values, as Alison indicated, have been under attack not only by the far right in all its forms, as in fascist movements and extremist nationalist movements that are rising in many countries, but also by religious fundamentalist movements, which we also think of largely as far-right movements, although they often cloak themselves in a kind of left populism, as indeed did National Socialism originally. But the attack on universal values has also come very much from within academic establishments. So that Feminist Dissent has within it many academics who stand against that, as Alison does. She's written a whole book on universality. She had an article in the first issue of Feminist Dissent on universality. But also from so the academics within the academy who are fighting this trend. But many academics in areas of law, and particularly the anthropology of law, which Pragna briefly referred to, who have developed ideas about minority legal orders or parallel legal systems, and in investigating what is there, have valorized it and decided that what is there has to be something that has to be valued. Because it's there, it must be valued. And that, if you're a feminist, is rather difficult, because if we decided that everything that exists has to be valued, then we might as well just consign ourselves to chattelhood and slavery and give it up. I mean, feminism is fundamentally about changing things that are there and things that are sanctified, and so that is what feminists do. But even gender studies in many places, in this country and in the US and in many other places, has embraced, in fact, very peculiarly via, and I didn't intend to talk about this, but if anybody wants to in the questions, we can try and address it, via queer theory. You might think that is something that is very challenging and unsettling of established values and religious values and so on. But queer theory, and Judith Butler, for instance, who is a very well-known queer theorist, has emerged as in the forefront of an attack on secularism, secular values and universal values, and an embrace of the other, and embracing various kinds of difference, as in queer difference, has embraced the fundamentalist as the perfect other to embrace. If you want, I think actually, I would say, as a way of narcissistically accepting your own perfect humanity, that you can embrace that which will kill you. So that's really where we're at in very, very powerful parts of academic theory, and including in people who work on issues around multiculturalism, multifaithism that Pragna referred to here in some of the universities in Bristol. So we at Feminist Dissent have set ourselves against these trends. And I think Alison forgot to mention, this is a free online journal. You don't have to pay anything for it. It's open access. Just, Google Feminist Dissent at Warwick University. It's hosted at the moment by Warwick University. There's some wonderful feminist dissenters at Warwick University who helped to get us the backing of the university for it. So you can access it very easily. so what we set up to challenge was this, as Alison described in the beginning, I mean, we're quite happy to debate issues of religion, but the main issue we're concerned with is issues of religious fundamentalism. And by religious fundamentalism, we mean very rigid versions of religion which insist that they're the only true ones. They're always highly selective. They're not ever the text. They're the text as read in a 20th or 21st century manner. So it's actually a very postmodern discussion of religion, and it exists in all religions. I mean, we cannot live in the era of Trump without realizing that not only is the Ku Klux Klan resurgent, but which of course had, you know, planted burning crosses at people's, you know, gardens, but also various forms of fundamentalist Christianity, which are dictating attacks on abortion and so on, which happened before. We've been here before. It happened under the Bush administration. The Bush administration greatly restricted the provision of development funding, for instance, that happened in abroad, and did things that would have been unconstitutional in the US, but they were allowed to do in foreign countries in terms of restricting who got what. Stopping giving money to organizations that were seen to be promoting abortion, and also that worked on issues around prostitution. They had to make a sort of anti-prostitution pledge. So, you know, we have the Christian area of work. We also have, as very, very seldom discussed in this country, a rising fascist movement, which is called the Hindutva movement, which has actually seized power in India. I mean, seized power by electoral means, has had a stunning victory in a major state in India, which is over 200 million people. But it seeks to turn India from a secular state into a Hindu state, and in which the Indians who live there, who are not Hindus and don't profess to be Hindus, should be invited back, as they say, to the fold, so that Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and so on would be encouraged to reconvert, because they conceive of everybody who lives in the land of, you know, the geographical area of India as being essentially Hindu, and they haven't recognized their essential Hinduness, and if they don't recognize it, then they should be, they'll be, you know, they're anti-national. And this is extremely serious. I mean, it's leading to lynchings, it's leading to threats to attack people who are eating beef or who are suspected of eating beef. It's leading to a very, very severe gender politics where people are actually crushed. You know, if they're couples who are holding hands or courting, and actually people, you know, have to meet in public spaces, because people often, who are not very well off, don't have private, you know, they can't go to restaurants, there's no private space where they can meet or enclosed public space. They meet in public parks and so on. And they're being attacked by what are called vigilante police, which are a slight oxymoron. So it's a very, very serious situation. It's not something you're going to hear about very much, because this government, which claims to be anti-extremism, is of course courting the Trump administration, hoping to get its trade deals, and it's courting India and hoping to get its trade deals, not only courting both these administrations about their trade deals, but also is embracing the political leaders and trying to associate themselves with the political ideology. I mean, Cameron had a huge campaign rally with Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he came here. And Narendra Modi, until he was elected Prime Minister, was denied visas to many countries abroad because he was implicated as Chief Minister in having had major massacres of Muslims on his watch as Chief Minister of a particular state in Gujarat. So it's just a brief, very brief roundup of how the issue of religious fundamentalism really affects our daily politics in all sorts of ways and in very global ways. I mean, and one of the area of Turkey gets some attention, usually around bombings that happen there, ISIS bombings and so on. Also Turkey's crucial role as a NATO ally in keeping refugees and holding, as a sort of holding pen for refugees. And there has been stuff in the media about how the Turkish state, which has also a similar charismatic now President Erdogan, who was Prime Minister, who's won power through election, but is really seeking to make the state more and more authoritarian through an electoral process. And he belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood, which I see as almost as a sort of mirror image brother party of the Hindutva movement. So you have all these major forces and alliances, but fundamentalism usually comes up in this country solely in relation to Islam. Now, we don't duck the fact that it is related to Islam as well, and that there is a problem with Muslim fundamentalism, which sometimes shades into terrorism, but whether it's terrorism in the form of planting bombs in Western countries or a wider form of terrorization through blasphemy laws, through declaring people apostates, through pushing women into subordinate positions, so that the kinds of laws that Pragna was referring to and that the women that she quoted were referring to were responding to, which go under the label of Sharia law, or in fact some of her quotes were about women from other religions who were also rejecting their forms of religious law. So those kinds of laws that we see existing here as sort of informal legal systems or parallel legal systems in this country are happening. It's important to recognize, not simply because they're inherent to the religion, but because they are inherent to the religious fundamentalist movements that are very active in this country and that have been tolerated in this country and given public space in this country by successive governments. And I think that is the issue that we have to hang on to. It's not about whether women will feel that they cannot be a certain way because some women do feel that, but what we have to unpick is what is the political process, what is the ideological process, what is the theological ideology that has caused women to feel that way. Now, when we took on the challenge, and we've been taking it on for some years, Pragna through Southall Black Sisters, myself through working with Southall Black Sisters, but through the Center for Secular Space, but also under the umbrella of an organization which was founded some years ago by an Iranian feminist and communist activist called Mariam Namazi, who founded an organization called One Law for All. So that is a specific organization, but it's also the coalition under which we work. So SBS is part of it, an organization called the Iranian and Kurdish Women's Organization is part of it, Center for Secular Space is part of it, there's a Bangladeshi women's organization called Nari Diganta. So it's basically a lot of feminist organizations. There's also British Muslims for Secular Democracy, which is feminist but not specifically women's organizations, and the Center for Secular Space. We're all part of this One Law for All coalition. And we took on the challenge of challenging the government around the issue of Sharia laws. But I'd say we did it in a different tone from the way it is done normally in the media, in which you have a very divided media, where the liberal media, represented by The Guardian, by and large talks about the demonization of Muslims and thinks that any sort of criticism like this about Sharia law and so on is racist, it's Islamophobic, and it's demonizing Muslims who are having a very hard time. And it's entirely true that there is massive anti-Muslim bigotry and there are hate crimes in this country and so on. And we absolutely stand against those. But then you get the right-wing media, the Telegraph, the Times, Mail, Mail on Sunday, etc., which do a lot of exposés on issues of Sharia law and so on, many of which are quite factual and quite well-based. In fact, I myself, very ironically, wrote for the Mail on Sunday and actually worked with them very well, using testimonies that we had collected my colleague Yasmin Rehman had collected for the One Law for All coalition, and a whole bunch of testimonies collected by Pragna and SBS and ICRO, the Iranian Women's Organization, CSS, and One Law for All together were presented to a Home Affairs inquiry that's going on Sharia. But what happened was that this coalition that we have, although we were really anxious to have an investigation on Sharia in this country, actually we were anxious to have an investigation on all parallel legal systems, and that's what we advised the government. We said, when they announced a Sharia investigation, we said, well, that's good, but we'd really rather have it broadened because there are issues in many forms of religion, that a lot of fundamentalist Christian movements, for instance, have very secretive elders meetings and groups and courts and so on. And what's happened is that we have actually managed, although we would have thought you were the body of feminists, activists, secularists, who would have most welcomed having a Sharia inquiry, we ended up boycotting the review that the government had, because that review had appointed a theologian at its head, 2 imams as advisors who were part of a regulatory body that should be in fact under investigation. And yet they were advising this review. It wasn't open. We accepted the need for certain secret, hearings in private of women who wouldn't want to depose in public, but they had no open material there at all. On the other hand, Parliament also caused, and also they were tasked to find good practice within Sharia. And this language about finding good practice within the Sharia councils, so instead of investigating, the task of the review was almost to actually find the good things in them, to look at whether there was discrimination and to look at the good practice. So the good practice was assumed, and the discrimination, it was acknowledged there might be discrimination, but it wasn't assumed. So on all these grounds, we decided we had to boycott this very secretive and dangerous review that the government has actually ordered. However, the Parliamentary Home Affairs Select Committee had a review which had similar language, but being a parliamentary committee, and because we believe in working with democratic processes and using our civil rights to the full, we decided to cooperate with the parliamentary committee, and that has produced, it hasn't produced its findings. It had a few very disappointing hearings, largely of pro-Sharia people. They had only 2 women, Mariam Namazi and Ella Manea, who is an academic based in Zurich. She's a Swiss Yemeni woman. And she has written a book on parallel legal systems and Sharia, and shown how regressive the particular forms of Sharia are that are practiced in these British councils. And a lot of us helped her with that book. And there were only 2 people with a secular position. Otherwise, there were Islamic feminists, there were people who promote Sharia in the Sharia courts, and there were also a number of depositions from us which exposed who is running these Sharia councils, and showing that they do see themselves, although they now claim that they are not a parallel legal system. There was a long time, and I think we won that argument, although we're at the moment losing the war. We won the argument that it's dangerous to have separate minority legal orders, because at one time there was an argument from the anthropologists, the legal anthropologists, the closet Islamists and so on, saying that minority legal orders are a good thing. Now what we found is that virtually all the academics who put submissions into the Home Affairs Select Committee blandly accepted a very sanitized view of what these Sharia councils do. In other words, they accepted the PR and they put it in as their findings, and they said all they're doing is providing women a service by getting them a religious divorce. And it was a finding of our joint coalition in our joint discussions, and my work with, for years, with Pakistani feminists, men and women, who had looked at what's happening in Pakistan and the legal changes that have gone ahead in Pakistan, and showed how these councils over here are not only a threat to British law and justice and British citizenship, but are trying to undo legal changes that have occurred within Muslim personal laws in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, and indeed in Egypt and other places, they're actually trying to undo those changes and create a version of Sharia, which they claim is, of course, immutable and the only version and so on. And that actually the key thing was the fact that they are selling these divorce certificates, so-called, when in Islam, if we go back to what Islam is supposed to be about, marriage is not regarded as a sacrament. It is a legal contract. And the courts in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and many other countries accept British civil divorces as the legal divorce. And yet, women who have those civil marriages still feel they're not properly divorced unless they have religious divorces as well. And so they go through those processes of humiliation and so on, where their divorces are delayed. Even if they've had a civil divorce, the Sharia court doesn't accept that they've actually been divorced. And it says, there's no divorce over here, it's not happened. And they put them through all this humiliation, and then eventually they sell them a piece of paper, which is quite worthless, which says actually you're divorced. And so they're trying to create a separation between the civil divorce and the religious divorce. And all the legal academics looking at this, except for a few like Ellen Manea, the legal academics and the anthropologists and the others, are saying this is fine. This is working in concert with the British legal system. It's okay. And one of the reasons they say it's okay, because Orthodox Jews have Beth Din, which do exactly this, and which the British courts have accepted, and which in fact they defer to in various ways that we can discuss in the questions. So I'm just trying to find my conclusion, which is somewhere in there. No, I actually wanted to, Pragna had such lovely quotes. I thought I can't be outdone with Pragna's quotes. I must quote something. So what we have really is something that's almost unbelievable. We have the police working with these councils. We have charitable status given to many of them. We have a recent report in the Times that recruitment to the British Army, a private meeting held in Sandhurst with religious leaders and officials from Sharia councils. The British state, and it is the Conservative Party and the British state, not just Labour. In the right-wing press, you'll hear about Labour's relations with Islamists, and they are very close and they are very dangerous. But believe me, this is a problem that cuts across party lines. It manifests in different ways, and this is the Conservative British state and the counter-terrorism lobby that have promoted these Sharia councils as one of the ways of controlling Muslim communities and selling women's rights while they're doing this. Now, years and years ago, some of you who are older, or some of you who've read the history of the Irish Troubles, will remember a case called the Birmingham Six, where 6 men, a pub in Birmingham was bombed and many, many civilians died. And 6 men were wrongly arrested and incarcerated for many, many years. And they had appeals that failed and failed and failed and failed. And they failed because, as a very famous judge called Lord Denning said, that this was an appalling vista, that if we accepted the appeal, he said if they won, meaning the right to appeal, it would mean that the police were guilty of perjury, that they were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary and improperly admitted in evidence, and the convictions were erroneous. This was such an appalling vista that every sensible person would say, it cannot be right that these actions should go any further. And what I submit to you is that we are facing this appalling vista of a state that is utterly implicated. It is these courts are not just happening in back rooms unknown. That is happening, but they are happening under the noses of the community police and under the noses of counterterrorism officials. And they're happening because this state is allowing them to go on. And what we suspect will happen with these reviews is that they will propose a form of regulation which will allow them to go on existing and which will slightly sanitize them at the edges. And that is extremely dangerous, and it is an appalling vista, and it is upon us now. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Gita. Okay, we have approximately half an hour for questions to both Pragna and Gita. So please start your questions now.
Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating talk. I just wondered if you would say a little bit about what you would think would ideally happen with regard to what the state might do. Because there's one thing if the state is supporting these Sharia councils, but what would you like to see? And would it be possible, in fact, to prevent them from taking place?
Sure. Are we going to take several questions or one?
Let's take a couple of questions at a time. But let's have another one to Gita, if that's okay. And then we'll open it up to both talks. One here.
Following on from that question, where do you both see the seeds of dissent, if you like, organised dissent? Where are the most important levers that we might use, either in legal professions or independent organisation or in the academy itself?
Okay, thanks. Let's have Gita. Do you want to respond to those two?
In Canada, there are two sorts of these religious councils. Some of these are these semi-legal ones, which some of them have charitable status and so on, so they have been recognized, but they haven't specifically been endorsed. I mean, the law hasn't specifically been endorsed. So they're now actually using that. So at one time they'd say, this is a minority legal order and that's great. But now they're saying, but actually we're not endorsed by the British system. So we're just there as a voluntary body that people just come to voluntarily. They've changed their arguments because we made such strong arguments against this parallelism that they're saying, but actually it's not that. It's just voluntary. It's alternative dispute resolution, because that's a great new buzzword that has to happen, to cut costs in family law and with legal aid cuts and so on. So in Canada, there are arbitration tribunals that have been formally established, as well as these other, more hazy bodies. In Canada, the Canadian Council for Muslim Women and some anti-Sharia campaigners and the YWCA got together and made different sets of arguments where they basically said we want abolition of arbitration in family matters, all family matters. We want to stop this. It is not useful. It actually denies us our rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights. It denies us our constitutional rights. And they succeeded. And what's really interesting is that all the Sharia promoters in Britain quote a document that was written by a senior legal officer arguing for these Sharia councils and arguing for a pro-legal system. And what they never mention is actually she was defeated by a feminist coalition, including many Muslim believers, many women who were ex-Muslims or, who'd come out of Muslim backgrounds but were atheists and apostates and so on, and Christian women who said we're joined together to have a strong constitutional foundation. So we have a very good, and we're friends with those people, a very good example of how it can be opposed. And the government could also, try many different measures, which they're not willing to do, because they will not take them to court for fraud, for misrepresentation. I mean, my Pakistani feminist friend, who's a man, Sahgal, who's written on these matters, said, what country allows people to go around calling themselves judges? Judge is a judge. It's a very honored position. And here they are. They call themselves, now they've started calling themselves religious scholars. But, until very recently, they were masquerading as judges. And the women who went to them often thought that they do have that power as judges. So there are lots of measures that could be taken. But I think my message to this audience, which is, I would guess, largely, not a Muslim audience, is that you actually have the right to speak up on these issues. I wouldn't essentialize Islam. I wouldn't demonize Islam. There are many Muslim feminists who are at the forefront of this fight, and there are many people who have chosen to leave Islam, and like Maryam Namazi, who is an apostate and calls herself an ex-Muslim, precisely because one of the things that she's shown in very powerful evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee, that they are not only involved in divorces, but also in producing fatwas and so on blasphemy, apostasy, and many other matters. So they don't keep within the law of the land. they are actually contravening human rights law and potentially, in many cases, violating the criminal law of this country by, for instance, tacitly, if not explicitly, promoting polygamy. So, people have not taken on that fight. I mean, we have, but we really encourage you to join us in it. There's a very good conference coming up in July on apostasy, on freedom of expression and apostasy and so on. It's in London. It is expensive because we don't have money. We do not have liberal funders funding us. We do not accept money from right-wing sources. So, for instance, there are Christian fundamentalist trusts that will campaign against Muslim fundamentalists, but we don't accept money from them. So, unfortunately, it has to be paid for. But if you look up One Law for All and look up the Conference on Freedom of Expression, issues like this will be discussed there, and in Feminist Dissent.
Okay, thanks. Now, I'm just going to take a couple more questions. So we have time for you guys to have your chance to respond or make points. Yeah, please.
Thank you for two fascinating talks. I'd like to ask the speakers if they could comment on the French state's reaction to fundamentalism and the consequences of this for feminist dissent.
I wondered if that would come up. Let's take one more, and then I'll give each of Pragna and Gita a chance to respond.
Did I answer the woman who asked the question over there? The first, the second one. What did she ask?
Thank you for the talks. I found both of them really interesting, and I learned a lot, factual stuff. And I'm kind of afraid that maybe I have a boring question, but it's a question about the Butler thing.
The question about? Judith Butler?
Judith Butler, yes. And it's two points. I wonder whether Butler doesn't have a point in criticizing some interpretations of universalism. So rather than just criticizing universalism, I guess that is going too far. But she's pointing out that there's a biased interpretation of universalism. And the other thing I wonder is whether this embracing the other is not, whether that is really problematic if you might think of the other as being structurally defined, so that the other is always the one who is structurally the most vulnerable, which then wouldn't be the leader of the religious community, the self-appointed leader of the religious community, but it would actually be the women and girls of religious communities, and those should be the ones embraced.
Okay, thanks. So, Pragna, do you want to...
Well, I want to come back to the question that was asked earlier also about spaces of dissent. Where are the spaces of dissent? Where are the seeds of dissent? I actually think women are dissenting in all sorts of ways around the world against these kinds of religious impositions by fundamentalists. But they're not the voices that are heard. And I think the problem becomes acute because they don't have the organizational backing. Okay, and when people decide to interpret what they're saying. So, the women who come, for example, at our doors, and the kind of quotes I gave, those are not exceptional quotes. They are routine criticisms. They are daily criticisms of women who say that we want to dissent against those aspects of our culture that we do not recognize, or religion that we do not recognize, and retain those that we do and value. That is a moment of dissent. It's an act of dissent. And our job is to support that. It's to support that voice, to facilitate the spaces so that they can articulate that dissent, and to connect with other women who have similar experiences. So that's one area in terms of the seeds of dissent. And from that, we're able to articulate their kind of collective experience. Certainly, we have dissented as an organization in all sorts of spaces, political spaces, certainly through the campaigns and so on, in communities, through our challenging of community norms and values, and of course in legal spaces. We've challenged not only the kind of racism that kind of can underpin constructions of the law, or sexism that underpins constructions of the law, but we also challenge religious fundamentalists who want to use the law to deny other voices of dissent, particularly women's voices. And to do that, we have really used the law as a site of contestation, and sometimes we've succeeded and sometimes we haven't, because the state is acquiescent, but sometimes we just get the right judge making the right comments. But we've had to use the human rights framework, the Human Rights Act, and the equalities legislation to challenge in those legal spaces. And for me, that has really brought home to me the importance of those tools as a means of dissent. It's not the only space of dissent, and as I said, more likely than not we get thrown back, we have setbacks, but it is a really important site of contestation and dissent, and we must use those laws. And that's why, for me, the most agonizing thing of this moment is not only are we up against religious fundamentalist forces in all religions that want to subvert the human rights framework, but we're also up against a state that wants to get rid of the human rights. So, for example, Brexit. In the context of Brexit, we have a state talking about repealing the Human Rights Act. We even have a state talking about repealing the public sector equality duty. Both of these have been used by us to challenge gender segregation in schools, in universities, and the kind of Sharia-compliant policies that we see coming through in institutions. So the legal space is also really important. Finally, the seeds of dissent are global. And for us, the important thing is not that people aren't dissenting, they are, but are we listening to those stories? Are those stories in the forefront? At a time when, as Gita describes, there's a left and right media that's up against us. But trying to get those stories out, trying to get that account out, and by doing that, also creating networks of solidarity, which helps only to build that dissent. So those are just some of the ways I think that we're trying to, where the seeds of dissent are, and what we have to do is try and join up these dots.
I'm just going to usurp my position as chair for 1 minute and say something about Dagmar's point. And I know Gita also wants to respond, and we will respond to the question about France as well. Yeah. I'm sure we won't ignore that one. But I just want to say, Dagmar made the point that surely Judith Butler has something going for her when she says that certain versions of universalism are not acceptable. And I'd just like to say, yes, it's true that, for example, early versions of the expression of human right applied only to men, and obviously feminists pointed out that human rights, that this wasn't a genuinely universal application of the notion of a right. I was at a conference in the US last week where a woman from mainland China was saying that in ancient Confucianism, even the concept of a person, which we take for granted in the notion of universal human rights, may be different. So you could have, for example, in the Mandarin Chinese symbol of a person, you have two. So a person might be two. So it's always possible to rethink what constitutes the notion of the universal. And if, insofar as Judith Butler is making that point, but I'm not sure that she is actually, I think that we can always say that there are certain notions of what appears to constitute the universal which are actually only partial. And so we have to rethink what is universal. But I think what we're trying to do is recognize that although there's cultural diversity and cultural relativism, that need not and ought not to lead to a moral relativism. And we ought to accept there are certain norms which apply to all. And if they don't genuinely apply to all, then they're not universal. I think that would be the response. But you made another point, and I think Gita will probably respond to that. So now I'll go back into chairing. And Gita wants to respond to that point, but also to, I think, your France point.
France is, of course, a vast country. It's large. It's not monolithic. It is a country that values the concept of laïcité, their version of secularism, which is different from the US version of separation of church, the wall of separation between the church and the state, and different again from, say, Indian versions of secularism. But I think the French, there are two things about the French. One is, of course, the huge rise of the fascist movement and the claim made in the name of the Republic. And of course, you know, that appears to be a universalist claim, the language of the Republic and the language of universalism, colonized by Marine Le Pen in a sort of semi-sanitized. In fact, I think the sanitization of her fascism is happening as much in the British media as anywhere else, where she pops up commenting about Brexit and so on, as if she's just another commentator with, you know, legitimate views that we should be listening to seriously. So I think that's very frightening, what's happening there, and her racism and her anti-Muslim racism is terrifying. But I think that many steps that the French state has taken at different points have been very much misunderstood. And I think the hijab ban in schools, which stemmed from a very early law that prohibited any obvious religious symbol, and which was taken after a lot of depositions and discussion, a commission of inquiry where many women and young Muslim women came and spoke about how frightened they were, about what was happening, about the way their bodies were being controlled, about rape, you know, in the banlieue, the, you know, various areas of largely, you know, French Muslim citizens, very, very marginalized people lived. And where there was a fight very similar, we feel a lot of fellow feeling when Pragna and I have heard speakers from France who are of Algerian descent, from left-wing backgrounds, who are feminists, speaking about their fights against the police on the one hand, the burning of their communities, standing there, trying to protect their community centers as young men rampaged around, but also trying to protect their communities from jihadism, from growing fundamentalism, from the imposition by these young men who have little control over anything else of the bodies of their women, their sisters, their girlfriends, and so on, of gang rape happening, and so on. You know, it describes a worse version of the things that we have to deal with here in Britain, in the communities that we have worked in and work in. So that language is there, that discussion is there, it's very vibrant. There's a huge misunderstanding in most of the Anglo-Saxon press about what Charlie Hebdo stood for, because for the French left and for secular French Muslims, they were absolutely on their side. They were on the side of people who were marginalized and oppressed by racism, by the Pope, by the mullahs, by Marine Le Pen. I mean, they spent a lot of time attacking the French National Front and anti-immigrant rhetoric and so on. And none of that's understood. So there's not one question about France. There's a France of Charlie Hebdo, there's a France of Marine Le Pen, there's a France of our friend Caroline Fourest, who's one of the best writers on unpacking what the Muslim Brotherhood and the more sophisticated versions of the Muslim Brotherhood, Tariq Ramadan, who's welcomed at, you know, British universities and so on, stand for.
In the area of work that you do you ever find that you struggle to draw the line between what is kind of a moral high ground and what is just kind of cultural imperialism? Because obviously it's not the law which is the moral high ground. I don't think that's what you're arguing. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Great. Okay. I'm sure both Pragna and Gita will want to say something in response to that.
Is it acceptable to have women on Sharia councils? You know, Gita was describing the two inquiries that are running parallel at the moment, the Home Affairs Select Committee and the one ordered by the government, which is chaired by Dr. Mona Siddiqui, a woman of Muslim background, a religious scholar, in fact. The issue for me isn't whether women are on the council. The issue is what the politics of these women are. You know, would you accept a leader of the Church of England, or not Catholic Church so much, but a leader of Church of England who subscribed to homophobia, or wife beating, or stoning of women for adultery, you know, or who part of wider Christian fundamentalist movements, anti-abortion, interested in protesting outside abortion clinics? just because they are women, would you find that any more acceptable? So for me, the question has never been just about female representation. It's more about the politics and the values that women represent. After all, in my area of work, one of the, a large section of the perpetration of domestic violence and other forms of violence is from mother-in-law. We have to understand that women can prop up patriarchal systems and inherently discriminatory systems of persecution in the same way that do men. So it's not a question of more women on Sharia. My fear is that is exactly where we're going to find ourselves. That the kind of light regulation solution that Gita was cautioning against, which is what the government is probably going to, what the Home Affairs Select Committee, maybe the other inquiry is likely to recommend, is if only there are a few more women on these Sharia councils, which are inherently discriminatory against women, sexual minorities and others, it'll be all right. So it's like tinkering on the edges, or as long as representation is all right. And the problem is that we're fed up with representational politics in and of itself. It's not the answer, it's what the values are, what the ethos is, what principles lie behind these things. So, no, is my answer to that. Okay.
Thanks.
I'll come back to the question about drawing.
Go on.
The nuanced position, do we ever find ourselves in a nuanced position where, between moral high ground and cultural imperialism? I think it's, one of the things that prevents us from, I think, moving towards cultural relativism, even when a situation is a bit more blurred, is to remember that what we're talking about are ideological and political processes. And once we understand that these are power politics, it's possible to tread that minefield and come down on the right side. Let me give you an example. There was a woman not so long ago, if you remember the Luton case of a young woman who wanted to wear the full niqab, except for the bit covering the eyes, to her school. It was a case of Shabina Begum versus Denby School. And she was very happily, it was a school that was largely Asian. Muslim girls largely went to it. They had a uniform, school uniform, that was carefully drawn up. The policy was drawn up as a result of consultation with parents, with the school community, and so on. And yet she rocked up at school one day saying, this is not what I want to wear anymore, having not had problems wearing the school uniform before, which allowed some allowance for cultural dress in terms of, long tunic and trousers, and instead demanded...
There was a headscarf.
And the headscarves,
optional
of course,
headscarf
optional. And she rocked up wanting to wear the whole works. And the school said, no, that's not the school policy. And she insisted, and so the school expelled her. So then she took the school to court on the grounds that her right to education and the right to manifest religion had been violated. It was only when it got all the way, I think, to the Supreme Court that the nuances were unraveled. Okay? So what we saw was the way in which, if you saw it just as that, you might struggle. You might say, well, what's wrong? Here's an individual young woman. Isn't she empowering herself by turning up and wanting to wear what she wants? Isn't she exercising her agency and autonomy? But actually, when you looked at the political context and the processes at work, you realized it was another story altogether there. And that was that the person who was insisting was not herself, but her brother, who was part of the fundamentalist group Hizb ut-Tahrir, who wanted to use this as a way of attacking secular education in and of itself, and to argue that Muslim children should not be educated in secular state schools. And he used his sister as a conduit for that campaign. And the other thing that came out in the narratives was that the other majority Muslim girls did not want this dress code imposed, because they felt that if the school caved in, they would in turn be coerced through peer pressure and in other ways to wear that dress when they didn't want to. And if they didn't, they would be seen as bad Muslim girls. And so the courts had to weigh up in what was a very careful weighing exercise, her interest, Shabina Begum's interest, against the interest of all the other girls who didn't want it. And so here was a situation which on the face of it you might think is a young girl exercising her agency. But actually when you unraveled it and you pulled it apart, you saw that what was at the heart of it was a fundamentalist-driven project. And I'm really grateful to the courts, and particularly to Lady Hale, who is the only feminist judge in the Supreme Court, for understanding that this had wider ramifications. And so the Supreme Court said, no, your right to education and your right to manifest religion were not violated.
Thanks, Pragna. I'm going to let Gita have, you're going to get the last word. And I think then after Gita's responded, or if she would like to respond, I think that will be the end. Please do stay around if you want to continue having little drinks and chat. You can get food here, as you well know. So Gita, and then I'll wrap it up after Gita's had the final word, unless you want to say anything else.
Fine. That's
right now. Okay.
But I think the cultural imperialism question was a great one, related to the Judith Butler question. I was just a couple of days ago at a really, truly appalling conference, which was full of Christian feminists. And so we got sort of gender-based violence 101 from somebody who kind of discovered it recently. And because they're Christian as well as feminists, they kept telling us that actually women commit violence as well, and we mustn't run away with the idea that it's all about male violence. And we know, as Pragna said, that women do commit violence. But, we're looking at power structures as well as, what individuals do in that situation. So they drained it of any kind of feminist or transformative element. And we were sort of treated to this discussion of violence around the world, and we were treated to the discussion of things like forced marriage and FGM and acid attacks and so on, with lots of horrific photographs. Now, I'm the last person who says these things shouldn't be discussed. But when there's a woman who's part of the Church of England standing there, say, excuse me, just tell me about how the Church deals with domestic violence. Tell me about how the Church deals with sexual abuse of children. Tell me what the hell's going on. I mean, I don't want to know about what's happening in India or Pakistan. I know that quite well. And it is appalling, and lots of things need to be done. There's a very active feminist movement out there, working in various ways. But, can we not have a little bit of home reflection about this, And I really did feel that was cultural imperialism. That was not, okay, there may have been other people there who benefited from this sort of general overview, but it was so drained of the role of, precisely what those people were representing. And it was appalling. Now, I think Judith Butler, in her embrace of the other, of course, universalism of various kinds can be criticized. Otherwise, there are all sorts of interpretations, and we all use different interpretations, and yes, it can be used for bigoted and racist reasons and so on. But that is not fundamentally what I think Judith Butler's critique is about, at least not when I heard her speak at the LSE in a lecture that was, I think, reprinted in the British Journal of Sociology. There she looked at the issue of enlightenment and secularism, and she used certain examples of possibly racist Dutch behavior about getting people who are coming, migrants to the country, to come and watch pictures of homosexual men kissing, to show them this is what our country is like, and if you don't like it, you can piss off. And she said she didn't want her freedom to have a relationship with, somebody of her own sex to be used in this manner, to tell migrants that they have to stick to these values. Now, what I found objectionable about the way she framed her talk was that she framed enlightenment as a Western product. And the rapporteur on the talk was a friend of ours, Chetan Bhatt, who's also part of the Feminist Dissent Collective. He's a man, he's a professor of human rights in the LSE now, and he's a brilliant analyzer of fundamentalism. And he talked about a person called Averroes, in some accounts, Ibn Rushd, one of the great figures of the Enlightenment, who was a Muslim. Rushdie got his name from him. So she was draining the Enlightenment of its well, he was Western, but it has a non-Western context. She was conceiving, and I think that is culturally imperialist and racist, conceiving the Enlightenment as a Western thing. Secondly, she is a Jew, as she herself would say, who is very keen on the rights of Palestinians. Now, that's a very honorable fight, and it's one, in many instances forgotten. But her embrace of the rights of Palestinians, and the rights of Palestinians to have a homeland and so on, is an embrace of Hamas as part of a global left-wing movement. Now, the Palestinians I know don't love Hamas. And it is the equivalent there, to them in many cases of the Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere, as a very, very violent, repressive movement internally, quite apart from what it might be doing in, sending rockets over to Israeli citizens and so on. So in embracing Hamas, she embraces that as the authentic Muslim. And in talking about homosexuals kissing and not wanting this to be seen, you could see that in her mind, she couldn't actually conceive of a bearded old man watching this from Afghanistan or some, Iraq or somewhere, who might be a homosexual and who might actually not have feelings of aversion and disgust, but delight and recognition in that. Her conception of the other, I find imperialist, racist, and, utterly obnoxious, because it denies the possibility of our movements of universalism and secularism. And I come from a background where that is my tradition. And that was our slogan when we stood and defended Rushdie. We said, our tradition, struggle, not submission. And it was precisely, we had a lot of arguments with white feminists, we as black feminists, who said feminists don't talk about tradition. And we said we do, because we came here with our secularism. It is our tradition. We are secular evangelicals in this country. That's what I've been doing for the last 30 odd years, is evangelizing secularism in this country, which I brought with me, fully formed from India. Thank you.
Okay, and as a white feminist, I'm going to have the last word. And I'm just going to say also that I think one more sentence, and I don't know why we always give so much time to Judith Butler, but anyway, we are.
Because she's poisonous.
Because she's a significant voice. But I'm just going to say one thing, which is that I think she also critiques the very idea of universalism. And there are certainly periods in her work where she claims that there can be no such thing as a universalist perspective. A universalism is always a disguise for a partial perspective. And I think that's going too far, and I'm sure you would over here, although I can't see you because it's very, the lights are very bright. So that's the end of the formal proceedings. I just want to say a couple of things to all of you, please. I said at the beginning that this is not only about feminist dissent, but it's also about this group called Social Science in the City. And on your chairs, you have a questionnaire. If you could please, at least some of you, just fill those in so we know what sort of things you like to hear about, and we can maybe organise some other events. I'd also like, finally, while you're fumbling around, like when on a plane that somebody tells you must fill in your immigration form, but at the same time they're telling you fasten your seatbelts and all that. But if you can do two things at once, which I know is difficult, I would well, there's some on some of the seats, but if you can perhaps find another seat where there might be one, and I'll try and find you one later if you really would like to fill one in. But also, could I end by thanking you all for coming along. I hope you've got something out of it. Thanking Pragna and Gita very much for their talks, but also, Miguel, where are you? Miguel is there. Miguel did most of the organising of this event. He publicised it and did all sorts of other things. Ben at the back here has recorded it. So could we please thank everyone who's done all this?